My name is Megan
call is
DeRogers,
being
and I'm the
recorded.
Executive Director of 100 Miles. I just want you to know that this call is being recorded, and it will be available after we'll put it together with the slides, and it will be available for sharing with your friends, watching again if you want to, if you like it so much you want to watch it for a second time. But it will also be available on our website, and we will share it with the National Parks Conservation Association and the Georgia Wildlife Federation for their use as well. I wanted to just go through the ground rules really quickly. Our presenters will speak for about 30 minutes. We will open the floor up to questions. You can email questions to me at Megan DeRogers, you can email me at megan@100miles.org, and my email address is on the next slide if you advance to the second slide. Throughout the presentation, I'll be checking my email, or when it's time to ask questions, we will unmute your lines, and you should feel free to speak whenever you feel compelled to ask a question during that 30-minute question and answer period. Okay, so your presenters today are me, Megan DeRogers with 100 Miles. If you go to the second slide, you will see who is speaking. Emily Jones is the Southeast Regional Director with the National Parks Conservation Association. She's located in Knoxville, Tennessee. And Mike Worley is the Executive Director of the Georgia Wildlife Federation, and he is located in Covington, Georgia. I want to walk you through the agenda, which is on the third slide. We will take you through an introduction, which we're participating in now. I'll give you a project background. We will then, the three of us will go through concerns, and those will be related to the Cumberland Island National Seashore, property rights, hunting, and fishing. And then we'll tell you what you can do to help speak out against this project. And again, like I said, then we will ask for questions. So without further ado, I think I will move into the project background. Camden County, which, as you all know, is the southernmost county on Georgia's coast, has applied to the Federal Aviation Administration for a site operator's license so that they can recruit a private spaceport operator to the county. If granted, the license would allow them to conduct 12 launches, 12 first-stage landings, 12 static fire engine tests, and 12 wet dress rehearsals from the site that you see highlighted in blue and at the trajectories that you see from that yellow triangle. Now, if you look at this map, you can see that the launches would take off over the northern end of Cumberland and over Little Cumberland Island. You can also see on this map that the property that is the launch site is on the Satilla River and at the mouth of the St. Andrews Sound. The type of rockets that they would like to use are called medium-large liquid propellant launch vehicles. These vehicles are between 8,400 pounds and 15,000 pounds. Now, they could fly smaller rockets too, but they've asked for a site operator's license to launch this size rocket. Photos of what those rockets would look like are included on this slide. One is the SpaceX Falcon 9 that was launched from Cape Canaveral in 2013. And the other is a Wallops Island launch that is actually pictured in the draft EIS that we are going to be talking about today. The site is, as I mentioned, at the mouth of St. Andrews Sound. This map shows that there are actually two parcels being included in the site consideration. One is a 4,000-acre parcel that is known as the Union Carbide property, and that is the property that is highlighted in orange, crosshatched in orange. And I'm sorry, we're on slide number 6. I forgot to continue to tell you, move through the slides. The second is highlighted in green, and that's the Bear Crop Science property. It's 7,800 acres. The county currently has a contract to purchase the Union Carbide property for $5 million. The environmental impact statement contains information about contamination that exists on that site. That site is the location of the thiokol plant explosion that many of you have probably heard about. So there is thiokol, unexploded ordnance, and other contamination that we know about so far. There is also an inholding that is on the Union Carbide property that the county is not purchasing. That inholding will continue to be owned by Union Carbide, and that's a 56-acre toxic waste landfill, and it's located a few hundred feet from the launch pad. As I mentioned, the Bear Crop facility is in green. It is listed in the EIS as a where the launch facility would be, but the county has no option to purchase it, and they are not in any agreement or conversations with Bear Crop to purchase the property. Therefore, there is no information in the environmental impact statement about the property or any potential contamination that it contains. However, we know that if the price for this property is comparable to the price on the Union Carbide property, the county can be expected to pay close to $10 million for this property. Let's go to slide 7. This is a site plan rendering of what the spaceport facilities would look like this is in the EIS. So you can see that there is a landing zone and a launch pad facility. You can also see where the visitors center is and the control center would be. If you look up in the left corner of the image on the left, you can see what looks like a brown patch of parcel. That is actually the toxic waste landfill. As the 3 organizations that are on this call today are thinking about this project and what it means for Camden County, I want you to know that we are thinking about it in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. Not only what will it cost in terms of how much money will it cost to bring a spaceport to Georgia's coast, but also what are the costs in terms of environmental damage, in terms of quality of life changes, and in terms of jobs that potentially may be offset because, as you will learn, there will have to be closures associated with launches. And so I wanted to mention to you that this is an important element of an important lens through which we are reading this environmental impact statement. So there are 4 steps to receiving a launch site operator license, and you can see those steps on slide 9. First is a policy, and this is not in any order. This is all happening simultaneously. But first they have to go through a policy review. The next is a safety review. Next is a launch site location review. And finally, there's an environmental review. The most important thing that I think is we need to remember about this is that the environmental review is the only part of this process that is available for public information. And therefore, our comments on this environmental document are very important and very helpful to the FAA. And really, honestly, it's our only opportunity to provide comments. We 3 on this call have 3 sets of concerns, which we will talk about today in these categories. The first concerns about the project's impacts to the Cumberland Island National Seashore. Second, we have concerns about the impact to property rights that this project will have. And finally, we have concerns about the impact the project will have on hunting and fishing that are popular activities in that area. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Emily Jones, and her presentation to you starts on slide 12. Emily, Alex is going to unmute you now.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with folks about this. You should be on a slide that has a picture of 2 little green bears on top of a logo that says National Parks Conservation Association. And just briefly, NPCA, and that's our acronym is NPCA, we are an organization that was founded in 1919 for the sole protection of our national parks. And you've got to kind of just think back to what was going on when the national parks were founded. And we just went through their 100th anniversary in 2016, so we're only 3 years older. World War I had just ended when NPCA was founded. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. People were looking for ways to protect vast swaths of land out west, but they were also looking at the land in the east and what was still left that could be protected. And Cumberland Island was some part of that. It came into being as a part of a national park when the Park Service was looking at developing national seashores. They had gone out and done a study in 1955, and they said that this was second only to Cape Cod in places of national significance on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. So in 1972, Congress designated Cumberland Island a national seashore. And one of the wonderful things about Cumberland Island and what makes it so unique of all the barrier islands on the Atlantic coast is the amount of wilderness that is there. And wilderness gives us an opportunity to be out in nature in a different sort of way. It's unencumbered by man, it's untrammeled by man, and it brings us a solitude that can almost be akin to a religious experience for many, many people who want to experience, these natural places in a way that, there's not cars buzzing by. There's not a lot of big hotels. You can literally get out there in the woods or out there on a beach and feel like you are in a place that was similar to the way this country looked when it was first founded. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about our threats to Cumberland Island National Seashore that we see this proposed spaceport as being an issue. The first, of course, is the visitor experience. Cumberland gets 60,000 visitors a year. That's one of the reasons why it makes it such a unique wilderness experience. We, as Megan talked about earlier, we are concerned about closures. Initially, as this spaceport was being proposed, they were talking about, we'll close 12 times a year. But then we start looking at the different kinds of rocket testing that they have to do, the delays with rockets, and we are very concerned that this is going to be much, much more than 12 times or 24 times a year, and it could be up to 70 or 80, maybe even up to 100 days a year, just depending, because weather, and there are a lot of influences that determine when a rocket can launch. Camden County itself has a very large tourism market. It generates about 749 jobs in Camden County, tourism does, and 86.9 million. Part of that is visitors to Cumberland Island National Seashore. I mentioned wilderness character, and that is that untrammeled, unnatural, and undeveloped experience. Cumberland has over 9,000 acres of what we call designated wilderness and another 10,000 acres of potential wilderness. In order for that potential wilderness to become part of this larger wilderness experience, the Park Service needs to protect these areas from noise pollution, light pollution, and the kind of things that impede that visitor experience. If this spaceport goes in and we are seeing more and more rocket launches across the top of Cumberland Island, that will make it difficult, if not impossible, to allow that wilderness experience to not just exist as it does now, but grow into a larger area. There are a lot of fragile historical and cultural resources at Cumberland Island. There are 5 historic and archaeological sites on the island. There are endangered species, rookeries, sea turtles, and in fact, in that area, that has been one of the largest and longest sea turtle studies that have gone on in the state of Georgia, and most likely in the United States. Surface water, we're very concerned about the Satia, the St. Mary's, and Cumberland River. And there's also groundwater aquifers on the island. We're not sure how those would be impacted. And then there's the larger question of the aquifers that supply fresh water both to southern Georgia and also the northeastern part of Florida. Fire. You've got a Park Service that has begun to do controlled burns there at Cumberland, but you still have a huge understory of palmetto that is pretty much, could go up and it's highly at risk, and that also impairs or it could create a threat to both the historic and cultural resources. And then the other thing that we'd like to see a lot more research on is the impact of the noise, and that impact on not just humans but marine mammals, such as right whales, and then of course our sea turtles. So I talked a little bit about wilderness character and experience, and we talked about it being untrammeled, natural conditions, and undeveloped, and this primitive as the solitude, this kind of recreational experience. And we want to provide these slides to also kind of give you some language as you start thinking about your comments, because what we really want you to do is think about what is special about Cumberland Island, what needs to be protected, and what your experience has been, and why you feel like it's important to be protected. Whether you have gone and camped out at Brick Hill Bluff or camped out at Sea Camp, these are places that you make an effort to go to. You have to make reservations. And like I say, only 60,000 people a year go to Cumberland Island National Seashore. So you've got this opportunity to be there in a place where you're experiencing nature in its pretty much untrammeled and natural setting. Cumberland has the largest maritime forest on the East Coast. When you think about your own driving down the beach, there's a lot of different kinds of experiences that you can have. There's places where maritime forest has been protected, and then there's places where we're seeing a lot of erosion. Maritime forest is one of the things that protects Camden County, Georgia, from flooding. And so here they are fortunate enough to have the largest maritime forest on the East Coast. That's pretty significant. 18 miles of undeveloped shoreline. That opportunity to walk on a beach where literally as you look down the beach line, you can see the curvature of the earth. Okay? This really kind of gets you in touch with our place in the system, in the universe. 1,000 acres of tidal marsh, and I think Mike will talk a little more about how important this is fish hatcheries and nurseries for oysters, shrimp. These are places that are incredibly important, not just for the value of Cumberland Island, but for the larger value to the community. The night sky. Cumberland is not a dark sky park, but the western end of Cumberland, specifically at the north end, is one of the darkest places on the planet. And when you look back toward the west where this spaceport would be sited, this is where you probably have the least amount of light pollution from the park. But that would change all that, of course. Natural sounds. You do hear some motorboats, and you probably may hear someone else on a trail at Cumberland, but what you don't hear are rockets launching over your head. And while this is something that's finite, if you've made reservations and you're out there and you've hiked 13 miles up to Brick Hill Bluff or 13 miles up to this, or 14 or 15 miles up to the settlement, this may be your one experience to be in that place. Closures may prevent you from being there. We're also hearing that they may make park visitors authorized personnel, which we're concerned, and FAA, I'm not sure if they're going to let that fly. But that sound of a rocket launching is pretty significant. The historical structures up there, when you look at the impact from the sonic booms and the decibel levels, it assumes that there will be no impact if these structures are highly maintained. I think most of us are aware of the fact that the Park Service does not have the funding to maintain all of these structures to the degree that they would like. So it's a bit of a misnomer to think that these structures have been highly maintained, but that does not make them any less significant. A lot of the historical structures up at the settlement are very, very important to the Gullah Geechee people, as well as to the families that were at Cumberland and have been given these places over to the national park. And they're important to all of us because they are a window back in history. This is the settlement. This is the place I was talking about with the Gullah Geechee. There's also structures that are very grand, like Plum Orchard. But again, these two have their problems with maintenance. This is a lot to maintain. One of the things it does not mention in its the environmental impact statement does not mention when it talks about viewshed is the view from Plum Orchard. It talks about from Brick Hill Bluff and then another place a little bit more south of the island, but it doesn't talk about Plum Orchard. But if you stand there at Plum Orchard, you can definitely see the site that this spaceport would take, and that would have an impact on your view shed as you're looking out toward the western marsh. There's a lot of cultural resources. There's over 4,000 years of human history at Cumberland Island National Seashore. The Timucuan Indian were there, long before us. And these archaeological sites have, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to do more education and excavation around that. Again, this is the thing that we are probably have the least amount of science on, but have one of the greatest concerns, and that is the impact to wildlife. We know there's manatee in that area. This is one of the, in fact, this is the area where right whales come to calve, and these are pretty fragile species that are endangered. So we have concerns about the mammals. We also have concerns about gopher tortoises and the various sea turtles that are in the area. We know that the proposed site of this launch pad, it is some it is sea turtle habitat, loggerhead turtle habitat. It's also habitat for the eastern indigo snake. There are rookeries that are very, very close to the launch site, and there's rookeries on Cumberland Island that are incredibly important. Cumberland's also a very important place for shorebirds, oyster catchers, red knots, plovers, brown pelican, roseate spoonbills. So we feel like this may pose a threat. It may cause a lot of what we call startle activity, where a bird stops feeding and moves on. And if you're familiar with migratory shorebirds, you realize that these are incredible animals that are taking trips basically from South America up to Canada and in some cases into the Arctic. And feeding is a very important thing, that they get fuel to get themselves on that journey. Fire management we touched on just briefly. While in Cumberland Island, the National Park Service does do some fire management there. They do have controlled burns. But in the case of rocket fuel and any kind of ignition that might spark, that would not be a controlled burn, and that could very easily become a wildfire. There is no fire department on Cumberland Island. When they do control burns, they bring in fire safety staff from all across the southeast region and the eastern seaboard, the Park Service does. So what would the cost be then? Would they have to have fire safety staff every time they did a rocket launch test or every time they did a rocket launch? Who's going to pick up that cost? The Park Service is very underfunded at this point. And how is this going to be managed? Because there's a big difference between a wildfire and a controlled burn. Recreation and navigation corridors. I mentioned earlier that Camden County has, over 700 jobs that generate almost $87 million in revenue. And we know all that doesn't just come from the visitors to Cumberland Island, although they're very, very important. But you also have a blue water trail that comes down the Cumberland and St. Mary's River. You have the Gullah Geechee National Heritage Area, and there has been a tremendous push around cultural tourism to get folks to come and, to new places or to places that tell the African American story. There's a brand new national park that is the Reconstruction Area National Park that is just at the South Carolina Georgia line, and so it will be a natural trip for people to come to Reconstruction Area and then come down into Georgia to see some of these Gullah Geechee sites and reconnect. There's the Intercoastal Waterway. We have a great deal of concern about the Intercoastal Waterway and how that will affect the boating traffic, not just recreational boating, but commercial boating as well. And then, of course, there's the Colonial Birding Trail. So there's a lot of reasons why people come to Camden County, Georgia. Cumberland is one part of that. We think it's a very, very important part of that, and it's a real anchor for this the tourism economy there. So I'm going to turn this over, I think, back to Megan or Mike, and they're going to talk about property rights. But thank you for your attention, and I'm available if you have any questions later.
Thanks, Emily. Y'all, we're on slide 30 at this point, and I'm going to start talking about property rights. But before I do that, I wanted to mention an error that I made earlier when I was talking about the weight of medium-large rockets. The Falcon 9, which was one of the photographs shown, was actually 1.2 million pounds, whereas I was listing something in the range of a few thousand. And so actually, I was a scale of magnitude off. So please remember that these rockets would be millions of pounds heavy. So closure areas. When you think about launching rockets, I think the first thing that people think about are, okay, well, where do we have to evacuate and what areas will be closed for the launches? Closure is mentioned in the draft environmental impact statement 180 times. But the information that is given is very vague, and in some cases we believe it's incorrect. And I'll explain that as in the few minutes that I have to talk to you about closures. But when a rocket is being launched, it is always true that there are evacuation areas and closure zones. And there's a very good reason for that. These rockets that we're talking about have a 2.5 to 6% failure rate. That means that out of the 24 launch events that this failure rate applies to, which are the launches and first stage landings that I mentioned earlier, Spaceport Camden could experience 1 to 3 explosions every 2 years, I'm sorry. And that's a tremendous risk that we are taking for our coast. Last year, there was a launch, and the FAA knows it, and that's why they require these evacuations. Last year, there was a launch scrubbed, canceled, because a fisherman wandered into one of the closure areas. They take this very seriously, and again, like I said, it's because of that very high failure rate. If you look at the slide 30, as I mentioned, it describes where the closure areas would be expected. So we're talking about the end of Harriet's Bluff Road and the waterways surrounding the launch site, including parts of Cumberland Island and Little Cumberland Island. And that 24 in there is an error. I'm going to delete it now. Extending along the trajectory out to sea. So this map is one that I made that I merged the two trajectory zones in together. And it shows a 5-mile closure area that includes parts of the Satilla River and south onto Cumberland Island. We have some questions about this map, which I'll explain earlier, but remember the 5-mile closure zone that I mentioned when you move on to slide 31. So closures, a little more information about closures, would be required for all 48 launch events per year. Up to 12 hours, the closures would be on a launch day, which would be a day where there would be a launch or potentially a first stage landing, with 4 to 6 hours being the typical closure time. A 12-hour closure period, according to the draft environmental impact statement, allows for potential aborts and contingencies. So it could be that the 12 hours would be extended. Maybe a launch would be scrubbed because of weather events or because a fisherman wanders into the launch zone or for whatever reason. And so even though a 12-hour time limit is usually, is what they hope to have happen, often those closures extend longer than just those 12 hours. And I wanted to let you know that a closure for a wet dress rehearsal or static fire engine test would be shorter than for a launch or first stage landing. The next slide shows that there is a little bit of lack of clarity in the environmental impact statement because we just don't know yet. While we do know that there will be trajectories, launches taken from a trajectory between 83 degrees and 115 degrees, the closure areas will also depend on the weight of the rocket and the time of year and the weather and different conditions that can be expected. However, we still see that closure area map in the environmental impact statement, and if you look at slide 33, you will see that it shows, like I mentioned, the 5-mile closure area, but there has never been a closure area in the launch of a rocket in the United States of this size, the medium large, that has been that small. Just last month, the Kodiak Spaceport was going to launch a small rocket, and the closure area was 12 to 15 miles wide. So we have some concerns that this closure area is limited. And we're concerned that it's shown here when it doesn't need to be shown in the environmental impact statement to alleviate some of the public's concerns about evacuations and impact. But it's shown at a very, potentially, I hesitate to use the word, but misleading diagram. If you look at the diagram on the right with the green circle, that's a 12-mile closure area. The minimum of what would have been applied as the small rocket lifted from Kodiak Spaceport. If we get much bigger than 12 miles, you can see that Jekyll Island and Kings Bay Submarine Base, and in this diagram, Crooked River State Park would even be affected. So we're concerned about the evacuations and the closures, not just to Cumberland Island and Little Cumberland and the area around the spaceport, but potentially even areas larger than that haven't been identified yet. So moving on to slide 34. In order to get around this in the environmental impact statement, Camden County uses a term called authorized persons. Authorized persons, they say, could be campers at Brick Hill Campground on Cumberland Island. It could also be owners of property on Cumberland and Little Cumberland Island. This authorized persons is not an FAA term, and that comes out of the mouth of an FAA official when asked about the term authorized persons. And also, there's no other spaceport in the nation that either has authorized persons or that launches over private property with homes and campers on it. And it makes sense that that is the case because you go back to the 2.5 to 6% failure rate. So what that means is that people are going to have to leave, and we are going to have to be open and willing to evacuate people from Cumberland, evacuate people from Little Cumberland, and also be prepared for the property damage that occurs if a launch fails. So on slide 35, you'll see that it basically summarizes what I just said, but there's another point about the purchase of insurance. So private launch operators would be required to purchase insurance to cover the loss or potential damage to any structure. The insurance would not be required to cover the damage to an oak tree or Cumberland Island National Seashore if it catches on fire, like Emily mentioned. And so there are definitely resources on here that can be insured. But who wants to lose their home? And who wants to lose priceless resources like a pristine environment, a maritime forest, habitat that is really very important to the Cumberland Island National Seashore? This leads into Mike's presentation about hunting and fishing. And so I will stop talking now and turn it over to Mike. You will be unmuted now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Worley. I'm with the Georgia Wildlife Federation. Just to follow Emily's example, Georgia Wildlife Federation is the state's oldest member-supported conservation organization. We were established in 1936, so we're in our 82nd year of representing sort of the hunting, fishing community, those that love and wildlife watching and viewing community, and also in working on protecting the wildlife habitats, and the natural resources that we have here in the state. So just to give you a quick background, and you'll see all of our contact information later. You know, I think you've heard from both Megan and Emily. One of the challenges with evaluating the impacts, both ecological and in sport fishing in particular, and in evaluating sort of the economic impacts of this proposal, is there are huge gaps in knowledge, huge gaps of what we know and what we don't know. And I think that's reflected in the draft environmental impact statement, or EIS. that we're looking at. So I just want to point out a couple of points of incongruity as we go through this. You see on my first slide here, trout in the Cumberland River, which is the water body between Cumberland and the mainland. The environmental impact statement talks about the fact that you can catch rainbow and brown trout actually in the Cumberland River. To the best of my knowledge, there are no rainbow trout within about 250 miles of St. Mary's unless you find them on a dinner plate. A few restaurants from the area might offer rainbow trout, but it's a cold water fish. So that's an example of one of the just the huge holes, the huge incongruities that go along with this draft EIS. And I think folks in the conservation world, in the wildlife world, and also the folks that are evaluating this from a regulatory standpoint are really struggling with some of these gaps in the way this EIS is presented. So you can go to my next slide. If you look at the exclusion zones that Megan was talking about, exclusion zones will preclude the traditional use of these, it's all caps, or in caps, trusted resource. A trust resource. In the conservation world, and in sort of our North American model of wildlife conservation, a trust resource is that public resource that's owned by all of us. This is a private enterprise. These are going to be private enterprise rockets that are being blasted off across Cumberland Island. The island is a trust resource, but so is the water, so is the fishing, so is the boating, so are the outdoor recreations. Those are things that belong to all of us, and to have Megan talked about property rights, but to have all of our rights to those trust resources subsumed to the commercial launch site and commercial operations is something that's just absolutely unprecedented in coastal Georgia. So just wanted to touch that with you just for a second. On the hunting and fishing components, commercial and recreational fishing will be excluded from these traditional grounds. When they're excluded, Megan talked about the fact that a launch was excluded by a fisherman who oftentimes I shouldn't say oftentimes, but there are occasions where fishermen, they may check the water, they may check the tides, they may check the weather. They rarely or not often get up in the morning and first thing they do is check the notice to mariners. And so you're going to have recreational folks going, sort of busting these exclusionary zones. But there are also things like crab traps. There are commercial guide services that operate off the Georgia coast. Many people don't realize this, but some of the most productive tarpon fishing in Georgia is exactly this area that we're talking about. This isn't just somebody going out with a cup full of worms and a john boat. These are commercial guide services that operate down there, that people make their livings off of this. There are questions I hear people asking constantly. Will I be able to go fish in Christmas Creek, one of those pristine, beautiful areas to go on a fishing trip? How do I plan a trip when these closures occur? They happen certainly they're scheduled, but we don't know. Is there going to be a scrub? Is there going to be what's the closure going to be like before? How long is the window? And there's this crazy thing associated with fishing that we often talk about as a hunter or as an angler. Is you actually have to fish where the fish are, and you have to be there when the fish are there, and that applies both to sport fishing and to commercial fishing. Just as an aside, as we look at this, we're talking about these numbers of days, and gosh, I've heard some folks talk about 12 days, and then I've heard some folks talk about 24 days, as much as 100 days. Think about this, and a shrimper on a good day. This is on a good single day in the coastal waters of Georgia, will earn as much as 20% of their annual income. So a single day is a big deal for that shrimper. So don't, whether we're talking about 12 days or we're talking about 100 days for these exclusion zones, this is an incredibly big deal when you close these things. One of the questions is let me go back before I skip on to the next slide. One of the other things that I would like to talk about is these areas are incredibly productive as a biome, as a place where, as Emily mentioned, shrimp, oysters, all of the fish are all these are areas that are incredibly important in the biodiversity and in the commercial diversity of our fisheries along the coast. When you search the documents for things like salt marsh is a truly incredible resource. It is the most productive biome that we've got. The EIS talks about it as a visual visiscape or visualscape. Doesn't even mention the fact that it occasionally does talk about it as a buffer for the launch site. But the truth is, this isn't just a buffer. This is an incredibly important biological nursery, if you will. Commercial fishing is not even mentioned in the EIS. I take that back. There is one mention in the EIS, but is only mentioned as part of the of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So it is commercial fishery and fishing, and as we all know, if you're around St. Mary's, there are commercial trawlers, shrimp trawlers at the dock in St. Mary's. It's a very important fishery. We don't know also how far out the exclusion zones will extend. This is the next slide. Can anglers get to an alternate site even? If an exclusion zone extends out 3 miles off the coast or 5 miles, perhaps you can get around it. If it extends out 20 miles, it's a big deal. That's a whole other thing to think about. Impact on the intercoastal waterway and boating and transits along the East Coast. Shallow water Jekyll Creek can only be passed at high tide, so people have to plan their trips, their trips along the intercoastal waterway based upon the tide schedule. Guess what? Rarely does a tide schedule pay attention to a launch schedule that a commercial operator's got in place. So if a person comes up on their trip down the intercoastal waterway needing to get past Jekyll Creek, if it's closed for an hour, they could end up having to be for 12 hours. They could end up having to be delayed for a day or two trying to get around that area. So I guess from the hunting and fishing component, and my last slide is these guys fishing the flats from a boat with their fly fishing gear. Certainly, recreation, commercial fishing are important, but some of the most important items, I think, are some of the things that Emily and Megan have talked about. How do we evaluate a proposal that doesn't even address these simple items of fisherman access? I've had some conversations with some of our regulatory friends, and they're concerned about how they get some federal consistency associated with the CIS and the regulatory regimes that the Coastal Resources Division has down there. So glad to answer questions. That sort of concludes what I was going to talk about, but glad to answer questions as we get to the end of this presentation.
Everyone, this is Megan, and I'm just recognizing that we're running over time. We're going to move through the action steps pretty quickly, but again, this presentation will be available online after we're finished. Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you to help us move quickly through the action steps.
Okay, thanks, Megan. So you have a photo that basically shows what the draft environmental impact statement looks like. And one of the things we would ask is if you can submit comments, please try to be as specific as possible. Think about what is meaningful to you. You can, if you want to go through a process that's pretty quick, you can go to the www.mpca.org Protect Cumberland, and it will take you through kind of a click-through advocacy. It's our action alert system. You can also write a letter to Stacey Z, or you can go to the FAA Camden Space Portal at Leidos.com. There's a lot of ways to get your comments in, but please send comments any way that you can do it. Megan, you want to talk about county commission and writing letters?
Yeah, thank you. Back on slide 41, if you click on that photo of the EIS, it'll take you to the EIS in case you want to read it or look anything up. And it is searchable, so you can search for, if you're interested in reading about the salt marsh, you can search for information about the salt marsh. Camden County, the commissioners at Camden County are making the decision about this project. Although they have applied to the Federal Aviation Administration for the license, they can pull their application at any moment, and they need to hear from the public about what you all think about this. And so I've included a slide that links their names to their email addresses and also provides you their telephone numbers. We also need people to write letters to the editor. And on slide 45, you can click the logos of the 3 local papers here on the southern end of the Georgia coast to write a letter to the editor and let them know what you think about this project. On slide 46, I wanted to give you some web resources that are available. And again, if you click on any of these images, it'll take you to the website that is associated with the image where this slide came from. There are so many people who know a lot about Spaceport Camden, and we all started knowing nothing because nobody really grows up knowing anything about spaceports. These websites will help you understand what the proposal is and what you can do about it. And then finally, we would like for you to become active on social media. And you can like the Taxpayers Against Camden Spaceport page. You can also Protect Cumberland Island Facebook page. And then we also have listed here the county's Spaceport Camden page because that's where we get a lot of our information. So whether or not you agree with the project, it's important to go to the source for the information. At that, Alex is going to unmute the phone lines, and we're going to make the lines open, the presentation open for questions, and she's going to moderate. All right, everybody, so you should be unmuted. I've got some of your names if you registered with a phone number ahead of time and you called in on that phone number today. If not, just please say your name as you ask your question. Does anybody have a question? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Nancy Claire.
Hey, Nancy Claire.
Hey there. So my question is, and I missed the first 5 to 7 minutes of this. I don't know if you went over this, but who is the money behind this spaceport?
The spaceport is this is Megan, and I'll take that question. The spaceport is a project that is being funded by Camden County. So the county taxpayers are funding the acquisition of the property that is contaminated and the infrastructure investment that will go into building the site. The county hopes that by building this site, a private spaceport operator will come to launch rockets. But right now, the county is spending money like crazy. The county's budget right now, annual budget is around $50 million, and to date they have committed to close to $10 million. Almost, it might be a little bit over $10 million now to bring this project to fruition. And like I said, there's still a property that needs to be purchased, and we think that that property will cost around $10 million. We also know that other places have built spaceports that cost up to $100 million. So the county is on the hook for this project.
And has there been any guarantee that there'll be some private interest that will like, oh, this is wonderful, we'll do it?
No.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Yeah, this is.
Go ahead. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to catch how many.
Oh, now we can't hear you.
I didn't quite.
Can you email Megan your question? Yeah, you can email me your question. We just can't hear you. Well, other questions? Yeah.
Megan, this is Philip Hodges. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Related to the first question, Camden County has undertaken this presumably on its own. Are we aware of any larger national or federal government initiative to have spaceports like this?
There's not public funding for these types of projects, but both the Obama administration and the Trump administration prioritize the development of the space sector in their economic development plans. But so far, there hasn't been any federal funds to help with it. They just are listing that as a national priority. There's a big, I should say too, rocket launch facilities are a small sliver of the space sector. Other categories listed in the space sector include the development of satellites. It includes machinery, equipment development, and things like that. So, and actually those, I don't have the list in front of me, but actually those types of economic development projects are often much more lucrative than a launch facility, because a launch facility is so expensive on the capital cost and investment on the front end.
If I could add to that just quickly, since the administrative push on this through both administrations have happened, there have been 10 launch site operator licenses granted in the United States for these private spaceports. In calendar year 17, there were only 12 launches. Most of these have been in sites associated with NASA, at Wallops, at Kennedy, or with the U.S. Air Force at Vandenberg. So you've seen a few places out in West Texas where Blue Origin has had some launch dates that they have, sent some payloads up with. But the market, we have a lot of questions about what the market is for Camden Spaceport. And I'm in total agreement with Megan. The space industry is a wonderful industry, but there are a lot of other much more lucrative ventures than building a spaceport and trying to attract someone to bring their business to you. And you have to think about Canaveral and Wallops and their location next to Port Canaveral, their location next to Norfolk, the trained personnel. How does Camden compete in this marketplace?
Other questions? I have not received the email from the person who was trying to ask the question a minute ago, so it would be, here it is. Okay.
I have a question. This is
for it.
Dottie Head with Atlanta Audubon Society.
Hey.
Does this in any way jeopardize the recent designation of the barrier islands as a landscape of hemispheric importance?
Thank you for asking that question. No, it doesn't. It doesn't today. It might, depending on the type of development that occurs and the impact that it has on Cumberland Island. And the designation of the Western Hemispheric Reserve Shorebird Network. I know I said that wrong, but that designation is really important, and it needs to be mentioned in anyone's comments whenever they're commenting on the environmental impact statement, because it's not listed in the draft environmental impact statement as a consideration. And
yeah, we're working on it. We're drafting a letter now, and it's in ours.
That's great, thank you. And we heard last week at the ceremony that when one of the sites across the world, when one of these 100 designated sites is impacted, it impacts the whole network, and so we definitely need to mention. There is a question that I just got emailed that is, how many feet from the launch site was the toxic waste site? I don't know exactly how many. It's a few hundred feet from it. And the issue with the toxic waste, the landfill, is that there's a contaminated plume that is under the landfill, and it's moving around. And then that landfill is on the banks of Todd Creek, and it's right at a oxbow of Todd Creek, and that side of the creek is eroding. So the creek is getting closer to the plume, and the plume is moving closer to the creek. So it's unclear how heat or vibrations or other impacts of a spaceport will affect the movement of the plume and the erosion of the bank. So that's a very important consideration that we did not mention today. So it's 1 o'clock. We're happy to stay on for as long as anybody has questions, but I just want to recognize that we know that some of you are going to have to jump off the phone. But we're here.
I have one more question. This is Nancy Claire.
Okay.
I know that often the language these county commissioners use is one of economics. Where can we get more data to show economic analysis of this idea and the cost of it and how it would impact other economic engines in that area?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, but I wonder if Emily, you would like to, or Mike?
You know, I have information on tourism. I think that there may be a lack of information about this in comparison to other industries. And Megan, if you have more information about studies that they've done, I'd love to see them.
They, the Camden County did do an economic impact study, but it was seriously lacking in that it talked about potential benefits of the industry, but it did not talk about the offsets of the industry. And so we really strongly believe that a thorough economic impact analysis needs to include not only what benefits the spaceport will bring, but those that they need to be realistic benefits, number one. And number two, it needs to talk about the shrimping days that will be lost, or the evacuations to Cumberland and how that will impact tourism and things like that, which are lacking, and there has not been a study like that, Nancy Claire. The Southern Environmental Law Center is talking to two economists, one with Emory and one with UGA, who are about doing such a study and including it as part of our comments for the EIS. I'll be happy to share those results whenever it comes out.
Okay, great, thanks.
Other questions?
So I have one final question. What is the timeline of this? Like what's the timeline of decisions that are being made when?
So the commenting period ends June 14th on the draft environmental impact statement. It's proposed that and we don't know because we're already kind of delayed by about 18 months, but the idea is that the final EIS will come out in the beginning of next year, and a determination will be made by the decision maker at the FAA sometime around next spring. So right now, regarding the license, that's the timeline. But like I said before, the county commission can decide at any moment to pull the plug on this project if they get information that compels them to believe that the project needs to be stopped. Right now, the people in Camden County, in the past, they've been kind of overwhelmingly in support of the spaceport, and I think they may still be, but the tide is turning. And, you know, we meet people on the street or run into people from Camden County who are skeptical of this project. And part of the reason is that they're deciding to fund things. They're deciding to funnel money to the spaceport instead of spending $30,000 on a new library or on renovations to the library. I'm sorry, not a new library. So they're making these choices because they have to make the choices about how to spend this money, and people are feeling the effects of, okay, we're putting money into this pie in the sky idea, but we have our roof leaking in our library. And those are hard choices, and people understand that. So like I said, the county commission can make a decision any day. And in fact, on Tuesday, one of the elected officials strongly in support of the spaceport at the state legislature lost his reelection bid, and he lost it handily. And the other candidate was pro spaceport, but he wasn't pro spaceport at any cost. And I think that's an important thing that the taxpayers of Camden County are starting to understand, that this may not be worth it at any cost. Okay, I just got another question. Well, I'm getting questions about the level of vibration in the toxic waste landfill, and I think that's a really important thing that we need to ask to the FAA and have the EPD provide information on. And so if you're preparing a comment letter, put that in there, ask those questions, because it's very important that they understand that that is a lacking part of the draft environmental impact statement that they need to do better about.
Right. And those kinds of questions force them to do some of the research that needs to happen around this. So, please raise these questions.
Other questions? Well, we're gonna send you a talking points sheet that will help you with your comments. Like I said, this presentation will be available. We'll make sure you have the link to it. And we thank you for your participation and interest in this issue. It's not an easy one. It's definitely a difficult issue, and it's especially made more difficult because the environmental impact statement has information that's incorrect. So it's hard to trust the information there. So I'm glad that we are talking together, and I'm thankful to Emily and Mike today for providing their expertise as well. Our contact information is on the slides. Feel free to contact us anytime. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks all.